Good evening, and welcome back to Lullaby Historian. Tonight, we begin with something very different. Hearth and hardship. How medieval peasants survived the coldest nights. A historical saga. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Hearth and hardship. How medieval peasants survived the coldest nights. A historical saga. The approaching shadow. Winter's advance. Setting the stage. The final harvest. Reading the signs of the deep winter. The year was 1345, and the world, at least the world that mattered, was the village of Oakhaven. Tucked into a fold of rolling, clay-heavy hills in the English Midlands, Oakhaven was less a place and more a perpetual condition of earth, smoke, and labor. Its loyalty was paid, its existence secured by its subordination to the distant, stone-cold authority of Baron Edmund's manor house, visible on the horizon only as a faint smudge of smoke against the bruised autumn sky. It was late October, a time of reckoning. The air was sharp, carrying the metallic scent of imminent frost and the musky aroma of damp earth. This was not yet winter, but the approaching shadow, the grim, final deadline before the land would cease to yield and demand payment for the long months of cold. The entire village was engaged in the final harvest, a ritual as crucial as breath itself. Every available hand was in the common fields, scraping the last edible roots, raking up the final stubble of rye and barley, and hauling the bounty back to the communal threshing barn. The Goodwins, Thomas, pragmatist of the earth. At the center of the communal effort was Thomas Goodwin. Thomas was the archetype of the medieval peasant father, broad-shouldered, his hands permanently warped by the plow handles, and his face weathered into a topographical map of sun, rain, and worry. He possessed the profound, pragmatic patience of a man who dealt only in tangibles, soil, seed, and the relentless cycle of the seasons. Thomas led his family in the back-breaking work. His wife, Agnes, a woman whose strength lay in her wiry resilience and her uncanny knowledge of herbs and preservation, worked beside him, her skirt hitched up, her movements efficient and practiced. Their eldest son, Will, a boy of 14 on the cusp of manhood, was tasked with guiding the weary ox that pulled the cart, his youth weighed down by the heavy responsibility. "The soil is hard, Thomas," Agnes observed, straightening up to rub the small of her back. "Harder than this time last year. She doesn't want to yield her last." Thomas didn't look up, his mind already calculating the yield. "She yields enough," he grunted, severing a stubborn root with his mattock. "The rye is solid, and the turnips are fat. It is the payment we owe Agnes that will bite deepest." He was speaking of the Baron's steward who would arrive before the first snow to take the tax of the land, a tenth of every stalk, every root, and every cured ham, leaving the peasants with the remaining 9/10 to see them through the long, barren months. Survival was a subtraction game, and the Baron always subtracted first. Reading the signs, the meteorological omens. Beyond the tangible count of the grain sacks, an ancient communal anxiety gripped Oakhaven. The peasants lived by meteorological omens, a collection of generations of empirical observations that rarely lied, and this year the signs were grim. Thomas, like every seasoned farmer in the village, had been reading the signs of the deep winter since the first hint of autumn color. The wild berry crop. The hedges, Thomas noted, were abnormally laden. The hawthorns and elder trees were sagging under a dense, dark crop of fruit. "The earth is making ready," Thomas muttered one evening,
pointing out the thick clusters to Will. She provides a double store for the beasts that will need it. It means a lean year to follow the white. The beasts and the bees. The squirrels had already begun their frantic early work, burying nuts deeper than usual. More tellingly, the honeybees, the village's only source of precious sugar, had sealed their hives with an unusual thickness of propolis, their entrances barely visible. Agnes confirmed the grim consensus. The bees are building a fortress, Thomas. They know the enemy is cold. The bird flight. The greatest and most unsettling sign was the speed of the migration. The usual stragglers, the last of the fieldfares and redwings, had gone early and fast. One morning, Thomas watched an entire flock pass overhead, flying low and urgently, their calls panicked. There were no loiterers, no false starts. The birds were voting with their wings, and they were predicting a winter of exceptional, brutal duration. The shared, unspoken consensus among the ragged collective of Oakhaven was grim. This would not be a mere cold season. It would be a deep winter. The demand for rigorous preparation. The forecast of the omens translated into immediate, desperate action. Rigorous preparation. Every minute of daylight was now a battle against the calendar. The harvested fields had to be swiftly turned over, manuring the soil with animal waste to prepare for the spring planting before the ground froze solid, a back-breaking task known as winter plowing. Agnes and the other women were focused on the final collection of natural insulation. They gathered vast quantities of dry rush and ferns, which would be layered on the dirt floors of the cottages to act as a crucial barrier against the rising damp and frost. This year, they gathered twice as much, knowing their lives might depend on the thickness of the floor covering. But the most urgent, immediate task was fuel. The Baron claimed the large timber from the forest, allowing the peasants only the deadfall, the brushwood, and the scavenged peat from the common bog. Thomas spent 3 successive days with the village men, battling the cold mud of the moor, cutting the spongy wet peat and stacking it near the village. Peat was smoky and gave less intense heat than wood, but it burned long and slow, a necessity for the endless nights. The volume of fuel required to keep the village hearths burning for 4 months was staggering. "We need more, Father," Will said, coughing slightly from the heavy peat smoke clinging to the air. "We will stack it against the north wall of the house, Will," Thomas replied, his breath misting, "and pray the snow packs around it hard. It is a terrible thing when the fire dies on a dark night."
The looming anxiety. The communal anxiety that gripped Oakhaven was complex. It was not just the fear of the elements, but the fear of the consequences of failure. Survival was a collective endeavor. The families relied on the common stores, the common mill, owned by the Baron, and the common defense against wild dogs and desperate strangers. A failure by one family to contribute enough labor or store enough food was a weakness that threatened the whole village structure. The greatest anxiety, however, lay in the balance of stores. Every peasant knew the math of winter. The squeeze was inescapable. Thomas stood outside his own single-room home, a sturdy, low structure of wattle and daub, as the sun dipped below the trees. The light was fading fast. He looked at the dense, low thatch of his roof, the walls plastered thick with mud and straw, and the small, heavy timber shutter that covered the single unglazed window. It was a fortress against the coming world of ice. He thought of the warmth of the central hearth, the precious, pungent smoke filling the rafters, and the smell of the cattle tethered to the lean-to wall outside, their body heat a vital, necessary resource. "It will be a long vigil, Agnes," Thomas said as he secured the door against the deepening chill. "We have endured worse," Agnes replied, her hand finding his. "We have the good rye, and we have the hearth. We will feed the fire, and the fire will feed us." But in the cold, thinning air of late October, the confidence was forced. The deep winter was coming, and Oakhaven was preparing for a war it could only win by endurance. The final, desperate work of survival was about to begin. Below the Baron's gaze, the feudal contract and the tax of survival. The frost that marked the final days of October was not merely cold, it was a reminder of Baron Edmund's reach. The stone of his manor, 3 miles distant and perpetually shrouded in its own privileged plume of smoke, was the unyielding financial anchor of Oakhaven's existence. The peasants of the village were not free men. They were the human resources of the Baron's domain, bound by a relentless ancient agreement, the feudal contract. Thomas Goodwin, even as he split the final logs for his own meager store, could not escape the knowledge that every swing of his axe, every sheaf of rye he stacked, belonged fundamentally to the Baron first. Baron Edmund, the power of life and death. Baron Edmund was a remote, formidable figure, rarely seen but constantly felt. His power was absolute, a cold corollary to the biting winter. He held the power of life and death through taxation, and the survival of Oakhaven rested entirely on his whim and his accountant's ledger. The contract was simple, though its terms were brutal. Labor for protection. The peasants, or serfs, were tied to the land, forbidden to leave the manor without the Baron's express, usually expensive permission. In exchange for the labor they provided on his fields, the domain, he offered them security, protection from external raiders, and theoretically, the promise of land tenure to feed their families. For Thomas, the protection was an abstract comfort, the labor a grinding reality. He had spent 2 full days this week working the Baron's land, ensuring the Baron's winter planting was complete before he could touch his own strips. "It is a hard bargain, Father," Will muttered one afternoon, his breath misting as he struggled to pull a stubborn root from the common land. "He takes the best land, the best yield, and gives us only the promise of warm walls." "He gives us the law, Will," Thomas replied, straightening up, his face grim. "And without the law, we are bandits with nothing but a stick. Pay the due, and the Baron leaves us in peace. That is the only protection worth having." Thomas knew that the real protection he needed against hunger and cold, he had to provide himself. The Baron provided only the legal framework for his own exploitation. The immediate threat, the winter tax. The arrival of the Baron's steward, Master Fitzwilliam, just days before the first predicted heavy snowfall, was always the pivot point of the year. Fitzwilliam was an officious man with a hawk-like nose and a leather-bound tally stick, the physical manifestation of the immediate threat of the winter tax. The taxes were not just levied on the harvest, they were levied on the very means of survival, ensuring the peasant could not sustain himself without enriching the Baron. Fitzwilliam arrived on a sleek pony, his boots pristine against the mud. He summoned the village heads, including Thomas, to the manor's boundary stone to collect the annual dues. The grain tax, or thurlage, the most essential levy. The peasants were required to bring all their harvested grain, rye, barley, and wheat, to the Baron's mill for grinding. The Baron's miller took a hefty percentage, sometimes as much as 1/12, simply for using the water wheel. "Your rye is thick this year, Goodwin," Fitzwilliam said, running his fingers through a sample of Thomas's yield, staining his hand with the peasant's labor. "The Baron expects a full measure from Oakhaven's bounty." The fuel tax, or wood geld. Although the Baron allowed the peasants to gather deadfall, they were required to pay a fee, often in eggs or small game, for the right to enter the Baron's forest and cut any wood at all, even for their own cooking. This year, due to the predicted cold, Fitzwilliam had doubled the levy. "The cold strengthens the demand," the steward stated flatly. "The manor requires more logs for its great halls. Those who burn the best oak must pay for the privilege of warming themselves."
The pig tax, or pannage. With the communal slaughter approaching, the pigs represented the most valuable source of protein for the winter. However, the pigs had foraged on the Baron's land, often in the oak woods. The Baron claimed the right to collect a share of the meat or the live animals in exchange for the foraging rights. Thomas's most vital asset was a sow named Bess, which he planned to cure for winter bacon and hams. He knew the Baron would demand the largest and fattest pig. "Bess weighs well, Master Fitzwilliam," Thomas stated carefully, "but she is lean from the foraging." He knew a lie was useless. Fitzwilliam smiled, a cold, humorless expression. "The Baron requires the 2 largest piglets, Thomas, for his Christmas table. Hand them over tomorrow at the slaughter." The collective weight of these levies was crushing. They were designed to ensure that the peasants survived the winter, yes, but only with the barest margin, leaving them entirely dependent on the Baron and devoid of any surplus that might lead to independence or rebellion.
The precarious political economy of survival. The tension in Oakhaven in these final preparation days was rooted in this precarious political economy. The peasants had to operate under 2 conflicting directives. Directive 1, maximize stores for survival. Every spare hour was spent hunting for nuts, drying wild herbs, and collecting every last stalk of grain. This was the work of life preservation. Directive 2, minimize the Baron's claim for independence. This required deception, accounting, and risk. Thomas engaged in the essential, dangerous work of hiding a portion of his yield. He stacked a certain amount of the best rye sheaves not in the communal barn, where they would be counted by Fitzwilliam, but in a small, hidden storage pit beneath the floor of his own cottage, a deep, dry space dug years ago and concealed by the hearthstone. Agnes, the more risk-averse, worried constantly. "If he finds the hidden rye, Thomas, he will fine us enough to starve us all." "If he takes his full due, we starve anyway, Agnes," Thomas countered, his voice low. "We must gamble. The Baron only counts what he sees. We keep the best for ourselves and give him the rest. He will never know the difference between the good grain and the grain that might have been lost to the rat." This act of concealment was an act of quiet rebellion, born not of revolutionary zeal, but of desperate necessity. The difference between the visible stores and the hidden stores was the margin of life for the Goodwin family come February. The trade of trust and dependence. Even as they rebelled through concealment, the peasants remained utterly dependent. The feudal contract was self-sustaining precisely because the peasants lacked the infrastructure to survive outside of it. The mill, they could not grind their own grain effectively. Without the Baron's mill, their rye would remain coarse and unpalatable, unfit for baking. They were forced to pay the thurlage tax to access the machinery. The law: if a wild band of outlaws or a rival baron's men attacked, the peasants would rely entirely on the Baron's small garrison of guards stationed at the manor for defense. That single point of defense justified, in the Baron's mind, the entire system of rent and servitude. Thomas understood this chain of dependence perfectly. He hated the Baron, but he understood the cold logic of the system. His family's safety was bought with their servitude. The cold truth, as the first light layer of snow dusted the roofs of Oakhaven, was that the Baron's tax was another form of winter itself, a brutal, unavoidable force that stripped the peasants of their surplus, ensuring they began the long months of darkness already on the brink. Thomas watched the Baron's steward ride away, his pouch bulging with the first payments of coin and kind. Then he turned to Will, handing him a shovel. "The pigs go tomorrow, Will. We pay the due, but tonight we dig the root cellar deeper. Every handful of turnip we hide, every inch of meat we cure, is food the Baron did not take. That is how we survive the deepest cold,
by keeping the small things that are truly ours. The winter tax had been paid, the ledger was balanced in favor of the manor, and the precarious political economy of Oak Haven's survival was set for the deepest test. The coming months would reveal if Thomas's defiance and Agnes's rationing could outlast the Baron's greedy calculation and the harshness of the predicted deep winter. Securing the store, smokehouse, root cellar, and the art of preservation. With the Baron's tithe paid and the final dreaded count of the grain complete, the people of Oak Haven turned their singular, desperate focus to the most vital event of the late autumn, the final massive effort of securing the store. This was the culmination of a year's labor distilled into a few frantic days of butchery, salting, and burying, the ancient, hard-won art of preservation that stood as the final barrier between their families and the crushing, slow terror of winter starvation. The communal slaughter, blood and bargain. The process began with the communal slaughter. The animals, the swine, and a few older, less productive cattle, had been fed on the last of the stubble and gleanings, fattened to their maximum yield. This act was not mournful, it was a necessary annual covenant with death to ensure life. Thomas Goodwin, despite the loss of 2 of his best piglets to the Baron's levy, brought his sow best to the communal barn. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of blood, muscle, and fear. This was intensely collective work. Every hand had a task. The men handled the swift, brutal butchery. The older women supervised the rendering of the fat, tallow for candles, lard for cooking. And the children, including young Will, were tasked with meticulously cleaning the intestines for sausages, a humble but vital form of preservation that wasted nothing. The immediate goal was efficiency. Nothing could be wasted. Blood pudding. The warm blood was immediately caught and mixed with oatmeal and suet to create blood pudding, a dense, high-calorie meal that would be consumed fresh over the next few days. Tallow and lard. Agnes and the other women worked tirelessly over large iron pots, rendering the fat. Lard, rendered clean and stored in crocks, was the indispensable cooking medium for the year. Tallow, when mixed with beeswax, would become the precious, smoky candles that measured the long hours of darkness. The smokehouse, curing in the rafters. The muscle meat, the pork shoulders, the hams, and the strips of bacon demanded a rigorous treatment to ensure they would last until the spring thaw. For this, Oak Haven relied on its communal smokehouse, a small, windowless outbuilding dedicated entirely to the alchemy of smoke and salt. The meat was first heavily salted, packed in thick layers of precious, expensive salt, drawing out the moisture. Salt was the medieval peasant's gold, the primary defense against rot. Thomas had spent days bartering wild-caught fowl for his meager sack of coarse crystals. Next came the smoking. The salted meat was hung from the thick rafters of the smokehouse. Beneath it, a fire was built, not of dry, clean wood, but of damp oak and hickory sawdust. The goal was not heat, but a dense, acrid smoke that would slowly permeate the meat, killing bacteria and sealing the surface in a thick, preserving rind.
Agnes supervised this stage, her knowledge of temperature control essential. The smoke had to be consistent and cold. If the temperature rose too high, the meat would cook rather than cure. She and the other women learned to read the air, the density of the smoke, and the slight telltale sheen on the meat's surface. "The smoke is the winter's friend," Agnes told Will, as they bundled the smoked hams in rough linen. "It hardens the meat and kills the hunger that hides inside it." The slow-curing meats, dense with salt and smoke, represented the protein core of their winter diet, a precious resource to be sliced sparingly over months, providing the strength needed for the taxing labor of wood gathering and maintenance even in the dead of winter. The root cellar, meticulous layering. While the meat was securing the roof,
the vegetables were securing the earth. The most fragile but essential stores were the root vegetables, the carrots, parsnips, and especially the hard, reliable turnips and cabbages. These provided the necessary bulk and, crucially, the meager store of vitamins that fought the terrible disease of scurvy. The root cellar was the heart of the preservation effort, a dark, frost-protected pit dug deep into the hard clay soil beneath Thomas's small hidden storage area. It was not lined with stone, but simply packed with insulating material. Thomas, Will, and Agnes worked together in the cold air, burying their treasure. Preparation. The roots were inspected meticulously. Any root with a blemish, cut, or soft spot was instantly discarded, as a single bad turnip could spoil the entire store. Layering. The vegetables were arranged in layers, not touching, separated by thick beds of sand, straw, or peat moss. These materials provided insulation and absorbed the dangerous moisture that led to rot. Carrots were buried in dry sand to keep them crisp. Cabbages were hung upside down from low wooden hooks to keep the outer leaves dry. This was a scientific endeavor of trial and error honed over centuries. The knowledge was entirely empirical. Know the dampness of the earth, know the needs of the vegetable. The cellar had to be kept just above freezing. Too cold, and the roots would freeze and rot upon thawing. Too warm, and they would sprout and waste their precious energy. The root cellar represented bulk and volume, the day-to-day filler that would sustain them through the monotony of the cold. The hidden rye grain, packed in woven baskets and buried under the cellar floor, provided the true hidden caloric surplus. The peasant knowledge of herbs and additives. The preservation of the smaller but equally vital stores was the domain of Agnes and the other village women, who possessed an essential, sophisticated knowledge of herbs, spices, and natural preservatives. Pottages and broths. Beyond the meat, they dried legumes, beans, and peas in the smoky air of the home. These would be combined with the hard roots and a small piece of cured meat to make the thick, sustaining winter pottages the main meal of the day. Vinegar and honey. Wild fruits, apples, crab apples, were pressed for juice and left to ferment into cider and weak vinegar. Vinegar, often infused with herbs, was used as a mild preservative for pickled vegetables and as a sharp flavor to mask the inevitable flatness of oversalted food. Honey, rare and valuable, was reserved for medicinal uses and as a final, concentrated caloric boost. The power of brine. Beyond the dry salt cure, chunks of fat and meat were often suspended in thick, concentrated brine, salt dissolved in water, in large wooden barrels. The brine was reused constantly, the strength of the salt solution fighting off every microscopic invader that threatened their winter survival. This knowledge was the intellectual capital of the peasant class, hard-won wisdom passed down through generations. It was the guarantee that the raw products of the harvest would not simply rot, but would endure. The collective nature of the work. The success of the preservation effort emphasized the collective nature of the work. No single family could manage the slaughter, the rendering, and the meticulous construction of a deep root cellar alone. The labor was shared on a system of mutual trust and immediate repayment, known informally as neighbor aid. Shared tools. The few expensive iron tools, the best knives, the salting troughs, were passed from family to family. Shared labor. Thomas helped the next family butcher their pig. That family helped Thomas lay the straw bedding in his root cellar. Shared responsibility. The entire village contributed to maintaining the temperature of the communal smokehouse, ensuring the smoke was consistent and the valuable stores of everyone were safe. This system of cooperation was not charity, it was a ruthless practicality. If one family starved, the next family's ability to pay the baron and contribute labor to the collective was compromised. In the face of the oncoming deep winter, Oakhaven's only true weapon was its unity. As the first heavy flakes of snow began to drift down onto the fields, not the dusting of the week prior, but the thick, committed snow of the season, Thomas and Agnes finally secured the heavy, clay-packed lid onto their root cellar. The air was still, cold, and absolute. They were exhausted, their muscles aching with the fatigue of a year's work, but they were ready. The meat was hanging high in the smoke, the roots were sleeping in the earth, and the hidden rye was safe. The knowledge of their hands, the art of preservation, had been successfully applied. "It is done," Thomas said, wiping the grime from his forehead. Agnes looked at the snow falling softly over the frozen earth. "Now, Thomas," she replied, "we must protect the store that walks inside the house." The focus was now shifting from the exterior threat of the cold to the interior struggle of maintaining life and warmth within the fragile sanctuary of the peasant home. The fortress of the home, architecture and insulation. Building the barrier, the anatomy of a wattle and daub home. The first committed snow of the deep winter fell on Oakhaven not in a flurry, but in a relentless, silent curtain. With the fields lying fallow and the stores secured beneath the earth and in the smokehouse rafters, the battle for survival moved indoors, centering entirely on the most crucial piece of architecture in the peasant world, the home. For Thomas Goodwin and his family, their single-room dwelling was not merely a house, it was a fortress, a meticulously constructed, low-slung bastion against the absolute, killing cold. It was a testament to necessity, built entirely from the resources of the land and the ingrained knowledge of insulation.
The wattle and daub enclosure. The peasant cottage was an essay in pragmatic engineering. It began with a stout framework of timber posts, oak or ash, hauled from the baron's forest under heavy watch. But the true strength of the structure lay in its walls, wattle and daub. Thomas ran a calloused hand over the exterior wall, now frosted with ice. The wall was composed of 3 essential layers. The wattle, a dense, interwoven latticework of flexible hazel branches or willow rods, woven tightly between the heavier vertical stakes. This created a rough basket weave structure, the backbone of the wall. The daub, a thick, heavy mixture of clay, dug from the local riverbank, manure from their own small collection of animals, and straw. This compound, mixed by stamping feet and turning shovels, was slapped onto the wattle frame, filling every gap and fissure. The insulating quality, once dried, the daub hardened into a monolithic, fire-resistant, and astonishingly thick barrier, often 18 inches deep. This mass of mud, straw, and clay acted as a slow-release heat sink. During the day, the walls would absorb the meager heat from the hearth. At night, they would release it gradually, slowing the inevitable heat loss. "It breathes, but slowly," Thomas explained to Will, pointing out a spot near the corner that needed fresh plastering. "The baron's stone walls are cold to the touch. Our mud walls are simply slow." The very nature of the wall dictated the life inside. Every family member had a role in patching and maintaining this vital barrier. Agnes constantly checked the interior walls for cracks caused by the drying process, filling them immediately with a small mixture of clay and water, aware that even a crack the size of a finger could bleed out the precious heat. The low roof and the thatch. The roof was the next critical line of defense. It was pitched low and wide, designed to shed the heavy rain and snow, and constructed with massive overlapping layers of bundled straw and reeds, the thatched roof. This was arguably the most effective insulator in the entire structure.
The deep overlapping layers trapped countless pockets of air, nature's own insulation, creating a barrier sometimes 3 feet thick. Crucially, the thatched roof served a double purpose, inextricably linked to the heat source. It acted as a massive smoke filter. As the smoke from the central hearth, which lacked a chimney, rose, it permeated the thatch, coating the underside with a black layer of soot. This preserved the straw, waterproofing it and repelling pests, while simultaneously curing the dried herbs and meats that the Goodwins hung from the low rafters. The effect, however, was a permanently smoky interior. The air was heavy, pungent, and perpetually gray, giving the entire cottage the scent of a permanent campfire. But Thomas and Agnes accepted the stinging eyes and the coughing as a necessary exchange for warmth and preservation. The battle against dampness and drafts. The constant, exhausting internal war fought by the Goodwins was against dampness and drafts. In the damp English climate, water was the enemy of warmth. The floor was simply packed earth, heavily layered with the collected rushes and ferns. This provided a barrier against the cold earth beneath, but it was a constant source of moisture. Agnes had to constantly rake the rush bedding, adding dry material and occasionally replacing the dampest sections, a chore that used up precious stored straw. The greatest points of vulnerability were the openings. The peasant home had minimal, small windows for 2 reasons: security and, more importantly, heat retention. Unglazed windows. The openings were small squares, entirely unglazed. During the deep cold, they were covered with heavy, rough timber shutters, barred from the inside. The oilcloth. For the few hours of the day when a tiny bit of light was necessary, the shutters would be opened only slightly, revealing a thin sheet of oilcloth, linen soaked in tallow or lard. This material provided a dim, translucent barrier against the wind while admitting a murky glow. It was a temporary, fragile fix, instantly replaced by the thick shutter when the temperature dropped. Thomas's daily routine included a ritual known as sealing the house. Using mud and old rags, he meticulously checked the joints around the doorframe and the window shutters, plugging every tiny gap. Even a pencil-thin draft, allowed to run unchecked across the floor, could lower the temperature near the sleeping area enough to be fatal. The single room, family, and function. The anatomy of the Wattle and Daub home dictated the entire social and functional structure of the Goodwins family's life. It was a single-room dwelling, serving as kitchen, parlor, workshop, and bedroom. The central hearth, discussed in detail in the next chapter, its heat created zones of activity: the warmest zone for cooking and spinning, the cooler zone for storage and tool repair. Sleeping area. The family slept together on a single shared bed frame, piled high with straw mattresses and woolen blankets, located as close as safely possible to the hearth, maximizing the shared body heat and the minimal ambient warmth. Tools and stores. Tools, small stores of dried herbs and hanging meats, were stored high in the rafters, kept safe from dampness and pests by the continuous smoke. This dense, crowded arrangement was essential. In the deep winter, the proximity of family members, the physical reality of sleeping 5 people under heavy blankets, was as crucial to survival as the thickness of the walls. It was the collective furnace of human life. The vital role of maintenance. The survival of the home was dependent on the vital role of the family in continuous patching and maintaining the dwelling. Medieval architecture was organic. It required constant, dedicated attention. One afternoon, a bitter gust of wind, stronger than any before, ripped loose a small section of wattle near the corner of the house. The temperature inside instantly plummeted. "The south wall! Go!" Thomas commanded. In the height of the sudden cold, Thomas and Will had to brave the elements. They gathered the clay and manure they had stored in a covered pit outside, mixed it quickly with a handful of straw, and worked with bare hands to repair the breach. The repair had to be done swiftly before the clay froze solid and became useless. Agnes stood inside, holding a dim rushlight, watching the thin plume of frozen air that had been rushing in. She knew that if they had hesitated for even an hour, the damp would have started to settle and the night would have become catastrophic. As Thomas sealed the final patch, his hands raw and aching from the freezing mixture, he looked at his home. It was ugly, smoky, and perpetually cramped, but it was theirs. It was the product of their own labor and their own earth, and its mud walls were the only thing standing between his family and the certain, crushing defeat of the deep winter. He stood back, the snow swirling around his feet, and looked at the low, squat shape of the building, a perfect barrier of earth and straw. It was ready. The furnace of the home could now be lit.
The earth and the fire, the centrality of the hearth. If the walls of Thomas Goodwin's cottage were the body of the fortress, the hearth was its beating heart, its lungs, and its soul. It was the absolute core of the peasant existence, the single source of heat and light that stood defiantly against the crushing, omnipresent cold of the deep winter. The air outside was now a thick, frozen silence, but inside the small wattle and daub dwelling, a constant, low battle raged, the battle to feed the fire and keep the life within the walls. The non-chimney core, an open fire pit. The Goodwin hearth was simplicity itself, a shallow, rough depression dug directly into the center of the earthen floor. It was a non-chimney, open fire pit. There was no elaborate stone and mortar structure, only a ring of packed clay and sometimes a few flat river stones to prevent the fire from spreading to the rush-covered floor. This central placement was critical. Unlike the Baron's manor, which drew heat up and out through massive stone chimneys, the peasant hearth was designed to maximize heat retention within the single room. The smoke, heavy, pungent, and unavoidable, was intended to linger, clinging to the rafters before finally filtering out through the loose, smoky thatch. "The fire is life," Thomas would tell young Will as he banked the coals each night. "It is the only thing the Baron cannot tax, and the only thing the cold cannot extinguish." The hearth served all four vital functions of survival. Heat. It maintained the ambient temperature just above freezing, enough to keep the water from turning to ice and the bodies from succumbing to hypothermia. Light. The flicker of the flames was the only light source after sunset, defining the boundaries of their meager world. Cooking. All meals, primarily thick pottages, were cooked in iron pots suspended over the flames or baked in the hot ashes beside the embers. Warmth. It provided the final essential warmth for sleeping, defining the crucial hierarchy of the family's nighttime arrangements. Fuel management, the brushwood economy. Keeping the hearth alive for 4 consecutive months was a logistical, day-to-day struggle known as the brushwood economy. The peasant had no access to the thick, seasoned oak logs enjoyed by the Baron. Their fuel was a mix of necessity and scavenging. Deadfall and brushwood. The primary fuel was scavenged branches, fallen twigs, and scrub brush, quick-burning, low-heat material that required constant feeding. Peat. The dense, spongy sod cut from the bog provided the long burn. Peat was heavily used at night because it would smolder for hours, requiring less attention, though its smoke was thick, acrid, and stained the air gray. "The fire is life," Thomas would tell young Will as he banked the coals each night. "It is the only thing the Baron cannot tax, and the only thing the cold cannot extinguish." The daily haul.
Thomas, often assisted by Will, had to venture out daily, even in the snow, to haul in a supply of fuel. This was a heavy burden. The fuel had to be kept dry, stacked against the warmest south wall of the house, and managed strictly. Wasting a single armful of fuel could mean a night of unbearable cold. Agnes was the strict fuel regulator. She allowed the fire to blaze only at dawn for cooking the morning pottage and at dusk for the evening meal and to warm the sleeping area. During the long, inactive middle of the day, the fire was reduced to a low, banked bed of glowing embers, kept alive under a layer of ash and peat moss to conserve every precious calorie of heat. A fire must be respected, not indulged, Agnes would remind Will. We feed it only what is absolutely necessary, or it will eat us alive. Smoke, the noxious preservative. The lack of a chimney meant the house was permanently filled with smoke. For the modern observer, this would be an uninhabitable condition, causing stinging eyes, persistent coughs, and difficulty breathing. But for the peasant sense, the smoke was a noxious yet necessary preservative. The dense, slow-rising smoke served three vital purposes: curing and preservation. As the smoke saturated the thatch and rafters, it cured the hanging meats, herbs, and dry sheaves of rye stored overhead. The continuous stream of smoke provided a chemical barrier against moisture and rot, an active daily part of the food preservation process begun in the smokehouse. Pest control. The heavy smoke acted as a powerful repellent against vermin, rats, mice, and insects, all carriers of disease and threats to the precious stored grain, avoided the thick, toxic air of the rafters. Architectural integrity. The soot deposited on the inside of the thatch helped to seal the roof, providing an extra layer of waterproofing and insulation. The entire Goodwin family accepted the chronic cough and the smoke-tinged vision as the inevitable price of warmth and safety. Their eyes and lungs adapted to the smoky environment. It was a small sacrifice to avoid the ultimate peril of a house overrun by rodents or a failure of the stored meat. The hierarchy of sleep and the diminishing fire. The hearth created the single most important social and spatial hierarchy within the peasant home, the arrangement for sleeping. The cold radiated outward from the walls, making the floor and the edges of the room the coldest, most dangerous zones. The sleeping area, a single large frame holding communal straw mattresses, was positioned as close as safely possible to the glowing hearth. Within this shared space, a strict, practical hierarchy governed who slept where. The elders and infants, the oldest and the youngest members of the family, those least able to regulate their own temperature and most vulnerable to the killing cold, were positioned closest to the fire's edge. Agnes often placed the smallest child, wrapped in sheepskin, directly between herself and Thomas, ensuring maximum warmth. The core providers, Thomas and Agnes, occupied the next warmest position, their broad backs acting as a shield for the others. Their strength was vital. They needed the most rest to endure the taxing labor of the next day. The older children, Will and his younger siblings, slept further from the hearth, relying on the shared warmth of the collective mass of bodies and thick woolen blankets to survive the night. The final act of the evening was the diminishing fire. Once the family was settled, Thomas would push the remaining embers into a tight, dense pile and cover them carefully with a thick layer of ash and peat moss, a process called banking the fire. This act choked the flames, drastically reducing the heat, but preserved the core coals, allowing them to remain hot enough to rekindle easily in the morning. For the long, dark hours between sunset and dawn, the Goodwin family relied entirely on the residual heat of the banked fire and the shared furnace of their own bodies. Any family member who slept too far from the core or failed to burrow deep enough into the shared blankets risked the deadly onset of hypothermia. The night's vigil, the fear of extinction. On the coldest nights, the central fear was not the barren, but the extinction of the fire. To wake to a cold hearth meant disaster. It meant shivering for hours in the dark until enough sparks could be generated by the slow, difficult process of flint and steel, and then waiting for the fire to take hold enough to cook or provide warmth. Thomas often woke hours before dawn, his eyes burning from the smoke, listening to the crackle of the embers under the ash. He was the sentinel of the fire. One night, the cold outside was so absolute that the fire seemed to shrivel under the ash cover. Thomas, shivering, felt the bitter chill begin to creep into the communal bed. He knew he had to risk disturbing the carefully banked coals.
He rose silently, pulled back a small corner of the thatch door covering to check the outside. The sight of the stars was chillingly bright and near, and then gently fanned the embers. The glow was weak. He added a few precious pieces of the driest brushwood he had stored beneath the bed. He waited, his breath held tight, until a small, tentative flame finally leaped up. As the light danced again across the rough earthen walls, throwing their shadows into momentary chaos, Thomas settled back into the warmth of Agnes and Will. The centrality of the hearth was not merely architectural, it was psychological. The flickering flame was the physical representation of their continued existence. As long as the fire was alive, the Goodwin family was alive. It was the heart of the fortress, burning bright in the eternal darkness of the deep winter. The breath of the beasts, harnessing animal heat. By the middle of December, the temperature in Oakhaven had dropped to a level where the air itself felt like a whetted blade. The damp English cold was no longer an inconvenience, it was a predator. Inside the cottage, Thomas, Agnes, and their children lived in a world of shivering twilight, huddled around the banked embers. But even the thick wattle and daub walls and the central hearth struggled to maintain a survivable warmth as the frost began to form on the inside of the timber door. It was during these most brutal stretches that the final, most desperate survival strategy was enacted, a practice that transformed the home from a human sanctuary into a crowded, multi-species bunker. This was the harnessing of animal heat. The living furnace, Agnes and the call to move. It was Agnes who usually led this transition. While Thomas was the master of the field and the axe, Agnes was the steward of the interior, the one who measured the calories, the fuel, and the creeping danger of the cold. "The wind is turning northeast, Thomas," she said one evening, observing the way the smoke from the hearth was being pushed back down from the roof. "The chickens will freeze on their perches by morning if we leave them in the yard." Thomas glanced grimly. This was not a romantic notion of living in harmony with nature. It was a calculated, ugly necessity. Every animal the Goodwins owned was a repository of future calories and current heat. To lose a hen to the frost was to lose eggs in the spring. To lose a piglet was to face a starving autumn. Under Agnes's direction, the family began the evening ritual of bringing in the heat. The poultry, the 6 scrawny hens, were brought in first. They were tucked into a small wooden hutch or simply allowed to perch on the lower rafters near the warmest part of the thatch. The valuables, the family's single prized piglet, the one saved from the Baron's tax, was ushered into a small fenced corner of the room, bedded down on a thick layer of dry ferns. The heavy heat. For the donkey or the solitary ox that Thomas used for plowing, the animal was not brought into the main living space, but
but was moved into a lean-to shed built directly against the house's northern wall. The science of ambient warmth. The biology behind this was simple but effective. A large mammal like a donkey or an ox functions as a massive self-regulating radiator. By breathing and maintaining a body temperature of roughly 38 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, these animals radiate constant, significant heat. By tethering the donkey in the lean-to share wall, the animal's warmth would slowly seep through the thick daub and wattle. Inside the main room, the chickens and the piglet added their own smaller but consistent caloric output to the air. On the coldest nights, this practice could raise the ambient temperature of the dwelling by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. In a world where the difference between 0 degrees Celsius and 4 degrees Celsius was the difference between water freezing in your bowl and staying liquid, those few degrees were the margin of survival. "Smell that, Will?" Thomas asked his son as the donkey settled against the other side of the wall with a heavy thud. "That's the smell of not freezing. It's the smell of life. An ugly necessity, the reality of the shared space." To the modern ear, the idea of sharing a single-roomed, smoky hut with a pig and half a dozen chickens sounds like a nightmare of filth. For the Goodwins, it was simply Tuesday. The harnessing of animal heat brought with it a host of challenges that Agnes had to manage with iron discipline. The smell, the already acrid air, thick with peat smoke, was now joined by the pungent aroma of manure, wet feathers, and animal musk. The stench was overwhelming, clinging to their clothes and hair. The noise. The night was no longer silent. It was filled with the rhythmic breathing of the beasts, the occasional rustle of the hens, and the grunting of the piglet. The sanitation. Agnes had to be meticulous. Every morning, before the sun was even fully up, the soiled straw from the animal corners had to be shoveled out and replaced. This waste was precious. It was added to the compost pile that would fertilize their strips in the spring. But in the heat of the room, it was a breeding ground for damp and disease. "Mind your step, Will," Agnes cautioned as she raked fresh rushes near the pig's pen. "Cleanliness is what keeps the rot from the walls and the fever from your blood." The family learned to move in a coordinated dance within the cramped space. They ate, slept, and worked within inches of their livestock. The boundary between human and beast blurred into a singular, shivering collective. The breath of the beasts as insulation. The most palpable effect was felt in the early hours of the morning when the hearth fire had banked down to its lowest embers. In the absolute dark, you could hear it, the collective breath of the beasts. The donkey's heavy exhalations on the other side of the wall acted as a buffer against the northern wind. Inside, the rhythmic warm breath of the piglet and the scratching of the hens provided a psychological and physical counterpressure to the cold pressing in from the outside. On one particularly savage night, when a black frost gripped Oakhaven, Thomas woke to find the water bucket near the door had a skin of ice as thick as a thumb. He looked across the room. The children were huddled together, but their breathing was steady. In the corner, the piglet was a warm, dark mass. Against the north wall, he could feel a faint, radiating warmth where the ox stood on the other side. He realized then that the animals were more than just property. They were living insulation. They were the final biological shield Agnes and he had deployed to protect their children. The harnessing of animal heat was a testament to the medieval peasants' unsentimental, razor-sharp focus on survival. It was a trade-off. They traded comfort, cleanliness, and fresh air for the one thing that mattered most, the persistence of heat. As the winter deepened and the approaching shadow turned into a permanent frozen reality, the Goodwins survived not just by the wood they burned, but by the very breath of the beasts they kept close.
Wool and linen, layering against the great cold. As the sun began its abbreviated arc across the December sky, vanishing behind the horizon by mid-afternoon, the world of Oakhaven shrank to the dimensions of the Goodwin cottage. Outside, the great cold was a physical weight, a silent thief that snatched the heat from a man's limbs in mere minutes. In this environment, the most sophisticated technology the peasants possessed wasn't the plow or the mill, it was the textile. Thomas, Agnes, and their children lived within a second skin of hand-spun wool and undyed linen. These fabrics were rough, itchy, and smelled perpetually of sheep lanolin and peat smoke, but they were the primary barrier between the human pulse and the frozen void. The science of medieval layering. The Goodwins did not own winter coats in the modern sense. Instead, they survived through a rigorous traditional system of layering. Each layer had a specific thermodynamic purpose, a logic refined over 1,000 years of European winters. The base layer, linen. Against the skin, everyone wore a chemise or smock made of undyed linen. Linen, derived from the flax plant, was breathable. Its primary job was to wick sweat away from the body. In the winter, moisture was a death sentence. A damp chest would lead to a chill that settled into the lungs as pneumonia. The insulating layer, the kirtle. Over the linen went the kirtle, a long-sleeved garment of medium-weight wool. This was the horsework of the wardrobe, trapping a layer of air warmed by the skin. The outer shell, the tunic or coat. For the men, a heavy, thick woolen tunic was added. These garments were intentionally oversized to allow for air movement. The wool was often unwashed, meaning it retained its natural oils, lanolin, making it remarkably water-resistant against the driving sleet. The extremities. Woolen hose, or separate leggings, were tied to a belt, and for Thomas and Will, these were often reinforced with leg wraps, long strips of wool wound tightly from ankle to knee. This cross-gartering prevented the snow from creeping into their shoes and kept the lower leg muscles warm during outdoor labor. "An itch is a sign of life, Will," Agnes said as she helped her son into his third layer. The wool was coarse, the fibers biting into his skin. If you stop feeling the bite of the wool, it means the cold has finally won. Keep the layers tight and keep the damp out. The communal bed, the physics of shared heat. While clothing protected them during the day, the night required a different strategy. In the Goodwin cottage, sleeping was not a private act, it was a communal survival tactic. The bed was a large, low wooden frame tucked into the corner closest to the banked hearth. It was filled with straw mattresses, large linen sacks stuffed with dried grain stalks and ferns. Straw was a brilliant insulator. Each hollow stalk trapped a tiny pocket of air, creating a barrier against the freezing earthen floor. The ritual of sleep was precise. The shared mass. The entire family, Thomas, Agnes, Will, and the younger children, slept together. They arranged themselves in a row, spooning together to minimize the surface area exposed to the air. The weight of the blankets. They were covered by several heavy felted woolen blankets. On the coldest nights, Thomas added animal hides, a heavy ox hide or a sheepskin with the fleece turned inward. These hides were windproof and provided a final crushing layer of heat retention. Head protection. No one slept bareheaded. Everyone wore a woolen coif or hood, even in bed. Since a significant portion of body heat is lost through the head, the hood was the most important nightgown they possessed. Inside this nest, the temperature remained a steady, humid warmth, fueled by the collective 37 degrees Celsius, or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, of 5 human bodies.
Outside the blankets, the breath of the family turned to frost on the air. Inside, they were a singular living furnace. The never-ending chore, continuous repair. In a world where a new tunic took months of labor to produce, from shearing the sheep to spinning the thread to weaving the cloth, repair was a survival skill. Agnes was the sentinel of the seams. Every evening, by the flickering light of tallow candle, she inspected the family's clothing. A hole in a woolen sock or a finning elbow in a kirtle wasn't just an eyesore, it was a leak. A gap in the fabric allowed the precious envelope of warm air to escape and the great cold to enter. "The needle is as sharp as the frost, Will," Agnes would say, her fingers moving with rhythmic grace. "A stitch today is a toe saved in February." She used darning techniques to build up thick patches of wool over worn areas. The clothes of the Goodwins were a patchwork of different shades of brown and gray wool, a history of their endurance written in thread. This constant maintenance ensured that the fortress of the home extended to the very fibers of their clothing. The psychological weight of the wool. There was a specific psychological toll of the winter wardrobe. The weight of the layers was immense. A peasant in full winter gear carried an extra 10 to 15 pounds of fabric. The constant itching of the wool against the skin, the smell of damp linen that never truly dried, and the restrictive nature of the hoods created a sense of winter claustrophobia. Yet, as Thomas stood outside to haul in the final peat blocks for the night, the wind howling through the leafless oaks, he felt the familiar heavy embrace of his tunic. He felt the warmth of his leg wraps and the solid protection of his woolen hood. He wasn't just wearing clothes, he was wearing the labor of his wife's hands and the life of the sheep they had tended in the summer. The wool and linen were more than fabric. They were the physical manifestation of the family's social and spiritual endurance, a soft but unyielding shield against the darkest nights of the year. The long vigil, managing the hours of darkness. In the modern world, winter is a season of artificial brilliance, LEDs, screens, and the flip of a switch. But in the Oak Haven of 1345, winter was defined by a singular, suffocating reality: darkness. By 3:30 in the afternoon, the sun, a pale and heatless disk, would slip behind the skeletal oaks. Within 30 minutes, the world outside was erased. For the Goodwin family, this triggered the long vigil, a 16-hour stretch of near total blackness that would not break until 8 the following morning. Managing these hours was not just a matter of staying awake, it was a desperate strategy to maintain sanity, morale, and the structural integrity of their lives against the encroaching winter madness. The battle for light. Tallow versus rushlights. Light was a luxury, a commodity measured in grams of fat. In the Goodwin cottage, the lighting was tiered by necessity and cost. The hearth, the primary light. The flickering orange glow of the central fire provided a radius of visibility. Beyond 10 feet from the embers, the room dissolved into impenetrable shadows. The tallow candle, the luxury. Made from rendered beef or mutton fat, tallow candles were precious. They were smoky, smelled of burnt meat, and required constant snuffing to prevent the wick from guttering. Agnes saved these for the most delicate tasks or the holiest days. The rushlight, the peasant's candle. This was the true light of the poor. Will and his siblings spent late summer gathering meadow rushes. They would peel the outer skin, leaving a core of white pith, which was then dipped multiple times into leftover kitchen grease or bacon fat. A single rushlight, held by a specialized iron nip or tong, burned for perhaps 20 minutes. It cast a meager, sputtering light that smelled of old lard. "Waste not the pith, Will," Thomas would warn.
Every inch of grease we burn tonight is an inch of fat we don't eat in February. The family lived in a permanent squint, their eyes adjusting to a world of deep shadows and dancing firelight. The work of the shadows, productive labor. Idleness in a medieval winter was considered a spiritual and physical danger. To sit in the dark was to invite the melancholy of the humors, what we now recognize as seasonal affective disorder, SAD. To combat this, the long vigil was filled with the work of the shadows. Spinning and weaving. The rhythmic whir-clack of Agnes's drop spindle was the heartbeat of the evening. She spun wool by feel more than sight, her fingers translating the texture of the fleece into consistent thread. Tool maintenance. Thomas used the firelight to inspect his wooden rakes and plowshares. He spent hours whittling new wooden pegs or treen, wooden spoons and bowls from seasoned ash. The children's tasks. The younger children were tasked with teasing the wool, pulling apart the tangled fibers and removing bits of dried grass, preparing it for Agnes's spindle. This labor was essential. It ensured that when spring arrived, the family would not be behind in their equipment or their clothing. But more importantly, it kept their hands busy, anchoring their minds to the physical world when the darkness tried to pull them into despair. The oral tradition, storytelling as survival. When the eyes grew too tired for the needle or the knife, the oral tradition took over. In a world without books, the voice was the only repository of history, entertainment, and law. Thomas was the keeper of the family's winter tales. They were a mixture of village lore, stories of the Great Freeze of 22, or the time a wolf was seen in the Baron's orchard. Biblical fables, retellings of the Nativity or the struggles of Job, heavily localized to sound like they happened in the next county over. Warding tales of the Green Man or the hidden folk who lived in the frost. These were not mere fairy tales, they were maps of the peasant's moral and physical world, teaching children which woods to avoid and which signs in the ice to respect. "Tell us of the great oak, Father," the youngest would plead, huddled in the straw. Thomas would begin, his voice low and resonant, filling the smoky room. These stories provided a psychological hearth. They reminded the family that they were part of a continuous line of survivors, that others had faced the darkness and seen the dawn. Winter depression and the communal presence. Despite the work and the stories, the great cold and the long vigil took an emotional toll. The isolation of the cottage, the inability to see a neighbor's light through the thick fog, could be debilitating. The Goodwins combated this through communal presence. They spoke constantly. Silence was viewed with suspicion. A family member who grew too quiet for too long was watched for signs of the winter fever, a lethargy that could lead to a loss of the will to live. They practiced a form of collective meditation. They would sit in a circle, their feet touching near the embers, feeling the heat of one another. This physical proximity was a biological and emotional necessity. In the heart of the darkness, the realization that they were not alone was the most powerful medicine they possessed. As the final rushlight sputtered and died, leaving only the dull red glow of the banked embers, the family would climb into the communal bed. The 16-hour night was a test of endurance, a long, slow climb through the shadows. But as Thomas listened to the steady, synchronized breathing of his family, he knew they had won another night. The sun would be late, and it would be weak, but it would return. The vigil continued.
Brewing and bartering, the sustaining power of ale and cider. By late January, the solid world of Oakhaven had become a memory. The grain stores in the Goodwin cottage were no longer measured in sacks, but in handfuls. The dried meat in the rafters was a collection of salt-encrusted bones. When solid food becomes a scarcity, the medieval peasant turns to a liquid lifeline. In this frozen reality, drink was not a luxury, it was the primary fuel for survival. Thomas, Agnes, and their children did not drink water. In an era where village wells were often dangerously close to animal pens and cesspits, raw water was a carrier of the bloody flux, dysentery, and other summer-borne plagues that could linger in the winter mud. Instead, they relied on small ale and fermented cider, the liquid bread that provided calories, vitamins, and safety. The science of small ale, liquid calories. What the Goodwins consumed was not the heavy, intoxicating beer of a modern tavern. It was small ale, a weak, low-alcohol beverage brewed from the secondary washings of the malted grain. Its importance to survival cannot be overstated. The boiling truth. To brew ale, the water had to be boiled. This simple act, though the peasants didn't understand the biology of bacteria, sterilized the water, making it the only safe source of hydration during the winter months. In nutritional density, small ale was unfiltered and thick with yeast and grain sediment. It was rich in B vitamins and provided a steady stream of complex carbohydrates. For a man like Thomas, who still had to haul peat through waist-deep snow, the calories in a gallon of ale are what kept his heart beating. The warming effect. While alcohol technically lowers core body temperature, the psychological sensation of the glow and the caloric energy it provided helped the family endure the damp, bone-chilling drafts of the cottage. The village brewster, the keeper of the ale stake. Brewing was almost exclusively the domain of women, and in Oakhaven, the undisputed master was Mother Elspeth. Known as the village brewster or alewife, she occupied a unique social position. Her home was marked by an ale stake, a long pole with a bush or hoop of greenery tied to the end, signaling to the village that a fresh batch was ready. Agnes would often visit Elspeth, not just for the ale, but for the yeast. The barm, the frothy yeast head of the fermenting ale, was essential for Agnes to bake the dense, heavy rye bread that accompanied their winter pottage. "The grain is sleeping, Agnes," she would say, her steam-reddened arms stirring a massive iron cauldron. "But the yeast is awake. It's the only thing in this village that still has a bit of fire in its belly." Mother Elspeth's role was a blend of chemist, baker, and community pillar. If her batch went sour or was blinked, spoiled, the village lost a week's worth of safe hydration. She was the sentinel against the thirst that could weaken a man faster than hunger. Cider, the orchard's frozen legacy. While ale was the daily staple, cider was the treasure of the autumn harvest. In late October, the Goodwins had spent days pressing crab apples and windfall fruit from the edge of the Baron's woods into a heavy wooden press. The resulting juice was left to ferment in sealed wooden casks. By January, the cider was hard, sharp, acidic, and potent. Because apples were more abundant than grain in certain years, cider acted as a vital caloric backup. It provided vitamin C, a crucial defense against the scurvy rot that thinned the blood and caused teeth to loosen during the months when no green plants grew. For the children, the cider was often watered down or mixed with a bit of warm honey on the coldest nights, acting as a mild sedative to help them sleep through the biting cold and the noise of the livestock. The barter economy, the price of a pint. In Oakhaven, coins were as rare as summer roses. Survival was governed by the barter economy. To get a gallon of Mother Elspeth's ale, Thomas could not offer silver. He offered labor or craft. One evening, Thomas took a finished ashwood spoon and a small bundle of dried medicinal herbs Agnes had gathered to Elspeth's door. "A spoon for a gallon, Elspeth.
The wood is seasoned and the edge is smooth. Elspeth inspected the grain of the wood. "Make it 2 spoons and a morning of hauling my water from the well, Thomas, and I'll fill your jug and give you a bit of the barm for Agnes's oven." This network of brewing and bartering was the social glue of the village. It turned individual skills into communal resources. No one could survive the deep winter in isolation. You bartered your strength for another's skill, your wood for another's ale. The ritual of the cup. Every night before the long vigil truly began, the family shared a communal cup of warmed ale. They would toss a piece of toasted rye bread into the jug, a practice known as sops, to soak up the liquid and ensure not a single drop of calorie-rich sediment was wasted. As they passed the horn cup around the hearth, the smell of fermented grain and wood smoke filled the room. It was a moment of quiet, liquid defiance. The ale warmed their throats and fortified their spirits. They weren't just drinking, they were consuming the stored sunlight of the previous summer's grain, redistributed through the skill of the brewster and the labor of the barter. The liquid bread held them together, providing the sustaining power that allowed them to wake up and face the frost once more.
The grip of the freeze, the threat of snow and isolation. In the early weeks of February, the approaching shadow finally materialized into a monster. It began with a sky the color of a bruised plum, followed by a silence so absolute it felt heavy. Then the snow began. It did not fall in flakes, but in a relentless, wind-driven deluge that lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. When the wind finally died, Oakhaven was gone. The village had been erased from the map of the living, replaced by a series of white mounds where houses used to be. For the Goodwin family, this was the midwinter climax, the moment when the carefully laid plans of autumn were pushed to the breaking point. This was no longer about living, it was about refusing to die. The walls of white, absolute isolation. The first crisis was the isolation. The tracks to the neighboring villages were buried under 6 feet of drifted snow. The path to the Baron's manor, once a vital artery for trade and law, was now an impassable wilderness. For Thomas, the isolation was a psychological cage. "We are on our own, Agnes," he said, pushing against the timber door, only to find it blocked by a solid wall of packed snow. "There will be no more bartering with Elspeth, no help from the manor if the grain runs out. We are the only living things in a world of ice." This isolation meant that any failure, a broken tool, a depleted store, or a sudden illness, had to be solved within the 4 walls of the cottage. The village community, usually so interconnected, was now a collection of isolated islands, each family fighting its own silent war. The thirst of winter, the frozen water crisis. One of the most acute and overlooked dangers of the deep freeze was the loss of water. The village stream, which provided the water for the animals and the brewing of ale, had frozen solid to the bed. The well was a column of ice. To survive, the Goodwins had to turn to the snow itself, but melting snow for water was a costly, exhausting process. It required a massive amount of thermal energy they could ill afford to waste. In scientific terms, the energy required to melt snow is significant due to the latent heat of fusion. To turn 1 kilogram of snow at 0 degrees Celsius into 1 kilogram of liquid water at the same temperature requires approximately 334 kilojoules of energy. For Thomas, this meant burning their precious fuel just to stay hydrated. Every pot of melted snow was a handful of peat that couldn't be used to warm their frozen limbs. "We must drink less," Agnes commanded, rationing the small ale and the melted snow water. "Every drop we melt is a minute of fire we lose tonight." The family lived in a state of chronic, mild dehydration, their lips cracked and their throats perpetually dry,
as they balanced the need for water against the need for heat. The vanishing fortress, depletion of fuel. As the freeze deepened, the most terrifying sight in Oakhaven was the shrinking fuel pile. The fortress of peat and brushwood that Thomas had stacked against the wall was being consumed at twice the predicted rate. The cold was so intense that the banking of the fire was no longer enough. To keep the livestock alive and the children from falling into a lethal lethargy, the fire had to be kept higher and longer. "The pile is half what it was at the New Year," Will whispered to his father, staring at the empty space against the north wall. Thomas felt a coldness in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. Fuel depletion was the ticking clock of their demise. He began to make desperate choices, breaking up old, non-essential wooden tools and eventually eyeing the very timber benches they sat on. When the fuel is gone, the fortress falls. The red hunger, the risk of catastrophic fire. The ultimate irony of the medieval winter was the risk of fire. To stay warm, the peasants pushed the central hearth to its absolute limit. But in a house made of dry straw, the thatch, and wood, the frame, an open fire was a red hunger that could turn a savior into a destroyer in seconds. The dangers were threefold. The thatch, the underside of the roof was bone dry and coated in flammable soot. A single stray spark from a roaring fire could ignite the ceiling, turning the cottage into a chimney of flame. The rush floor, the insulating rushes on the floor were essentially kindling. If a coal popped out of the hearth ring while the family slept, the entire floor would ignite. And the wind. The gale force winds outside created a Venturi effect, pulling air through the gaps in the wattle and causing the hearth fire to flare up unpredictably. "Watch the embers, Will. Keep the screen up," Thomas shouted one night, as a sudden gust sent a shower of sparks toward the sleeping children. A house fire in Oakhaven during the freeze was a death sentence. Even if the family escaped the flames, they would emerge into minus 15 degrees Celsius temperatures with no shelter, no clothes, and no stores. In the midwinter climax, the very thing that kept them alive was the greatest threat to their existence. The breaking point. As February dragged on, the Goodwin family reached their breaking point. The isolation was absolute, the water was a luxury, the fuel was vanishing, and the fire was a constant, terrifying companion. They were living in a world of white outside and gray smoke inside, their bodies thinning as the rationing took hold. Thomas looked at his family, huddled together in the flickering light. They were still alive, but the grip of the freeze was tightening. The survival strategies of autumn were failing. Now they were entering the realm of pure, unadorned endurance. The scarcity principle, rationing, and the politics of the village pot. By the middle of February, the hunger moon hung like a cold silver coin over Oakhaven. The festive communal slaughters of November now were a haunting memory. Inside the Goodwin cottage, the atmosphere had shifted from one of busy preparation to a heavy, watchful silence. This was the era of the scarcity principle, a period where every calorie was a calculated investment and every bite of bread was a political act. The root cellar, once a treasure chest of parsnips and turnips, was now a cavern of echoes. The village pot, the communal ideal of shared resources, was simmering thin, and with its depletion, the very fabric of Oakhaven began to fray.
The mathematics of starvation. Survival in the deep winter was a brutal equation. A human body in a freezing environment requires significantly more energy simply to maintain its core temperature, 37 degrees Celsius. For Thomas and his family, the math was simple and terrifying. When the energy coming in from their meager pottage was less than the energy spent hauling peat or simply shivering, the body began to consume itself. Agnes became the master of the ladle. She practiced a form of caloric prioritization
that was as logical as it was heart-wrenching. She divided the daily pottage, a watery stew of a few wizened turnips, a handful of legumes, and the scrapings of a ham bone, based on the survival value of each family member. The laborer, Thomas, he received the largest portion. If Thomas grew too weak to cut wood or clear the snow-blocked doorway, the entire family would perish in days. The future, Will, as the eldest son and primary helper, Will received the next largest share. His growth was secondary to his utility. He needed the strength to keep the donkey alive and assist his father. The vulnerable, the youngest and the old. The smaller children received just enough to keep the slow fire of their lives burning. The stoic, Agnes. As was common for peasant women, Agnes often took the smallest portion, claiming she wasn't hungry or had nibbled while cooking. In reality, she was sacrificing her own body mass to ensure the others remained functional. The politics of the village pot. In a medieval village, no house was an island. Traditionally, Oakhaven operated on a system of the village pot, a communal understanding that those with a little extra would help those with nothing. But as the isolation deepened and the grip of the freeze tightened, this cooperation shifted into internal competition. A knock at the door was no longer a welcome social call. It was a source of anxiety. One evening, their neighbor, a man named Peter the Fletcher, came to the Goodwins' door. He looked gaunt, his eyes deep set in a face gray with cold. "Thomas," he rasped, "our stores are gone. The rats got into the grain pit. My children haven't had more than a crust in 3 days." Thomas felt the weight of the hidden rye beneath the floorboards. To share would be to shorten his own children's lives. To refuse would be to break the communal bond that defined their humanity. "We have little ourselves, Peter," Thomas said, his voice thick with a guilt that tasted like iron. He looked back at Agnes, who gave a near imperceptible shake of her head. They were at the limit. A few turnips, perhaps, no more. The encounter left a bitter taste in the air. This was the politics of the pot, the silent negotiation between the instinct to save one's own kin and the social requirement to be a good neighbor. Suspicion and the hoarding myth. As hunger sharpened the mind, it also sharpened suspicion. In the absence of news from the outside world, the village turned inward. Rumors began to circulate through the smoky cottages. Did the miller keep back more than his share of the grind? Why does the smith's smoke look so thick? Is he burning more than brushwood? Is Thomas Goodwin hiding grain? Thomas noticed the way neighbors looked at his cottage. Because he had been more diligent in his autumn preparations, his family appeared slightly less haggard than others. In a time of scarcity, preparedness was often mistaken for hoarding. "They watch the door, Thomas," whispered Agnes. "They see you hauling peat and think we are rich. They don't see the empty sacks." This suspicion was a toxin. It destroyed the neighbor aid that had built the wattle and daub walls. People began to hide their cooking, keeping the pot covered so the smell of a rare piece of meat wouldn't drift through the gaps in the walls. The community was regressing into a collection of individual survivalists, each viewing the other as a potential thief of their remaining days. The breaking of the feudal contract. The scarcity also reached the baron's gaze, though in a different form. The peasants knew that if they grew too weak to work, the baron would have no reason to protect them come spring. But the baron's own stores were not infinite. The political economy of survival meant that the baron began to view his peasants not as people, but as depleting assets. If a family in Oakhaven died, their strip of land would simply be reassigned. There was no safety net in 1345. There was only the cold calculation of the scarcity principle.
As February came to a close, the Goodwins survived not by the grace of the Lord or the kindness of the village, but by the ruthless, silent discipline of Agnes's ladle and the desperate secrecy of Thomas's hidden grain. They had survived the cold, but they had lost the comfort of the community. They were alone in a village of ghosts, waiting for the first sign that the earth might once again provide.
Whispers and warding, magic, faith, and the winter maladies. By the end of February, the physical world of Oakhaven had been stripped of its color and its substance. But as the physical stores of grain and wood vanished, the invisible world, the world of whispers and warding, grew terrifyingly vivid. For Thomas and Agnes Goodwin, the cold was no longer just a weather pattern, it was a sentient predator. It was the ice hag scratching at the wattle. It was the breath of the grave slipping through the thatch. In the medieval mind, illness was not a matter of germs, but a spiritual and elemental imbalance. As the winter maladies began to sweep through the smoke-choked cottages, the peasants turned to a desperate blend of Orthodox Christianity and ancient folk remedies to defend the flickering light of their lives. The theory of the humors, why the cold killed. To understand why the Goodwins feared the winter, one must understand how they viewed their own bodies. According to the medical wisdom of the day, health was governed by the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Winter was the season of phlegm, the humor that was cold and moist. When the great cold pressed against the cottage walls, the peasants believed it thickened the phlegm in their chests, causing the great cough, pneumonia, or slowing the blood until the heart simply stopped in the white sleep, hypothermia. "The damp is settling in her chest," Thomas whispered, looking at their youngest daughter, Ilara, whose breath had taken on a wet, rattling sound. "The humors are heavy. We must draw the cold out before it turns to stone." The arsenal of warding, charms, and faith. The defense against the maladies was a layered shield of superstition and piety. The Goodwins did not see a contradiction between praying to the Virgin Mary and burying a piece of iron under the doorstep. The Christian shield, above the door, Thomas had carved a small cross and rubbed it with holy water saved from the Feast of Epiphany. They recited the Pater Noster, Our Father, not just as a prayer, but as a rhythmic incantation to keep the spirits of the air at bay. The folk wards. Beneath the straw of Ilara's bed, Agnes placed a satyr square, a palindromic word charm written on a scrap of sheepskin, believed to confuse the demons of fever. Around the girl's neck, she hung a small pouch containing a cramp stone, a fossilized sea urchin, and a dried sprig of St. John's wort. The iron defense. Iron was believed to repel the hidden folk who brought the frost. Thomas kept his iron shears near the hearth, convinced that the metal's heat would scare away the spirits of the freeze. This was spiritual insulation. It gave the family a sense of agency in a world where they were otherwise entirely helpless. The village healer, simples and poultices. When Ilara's fever spiked, turning her cheeks a terrifying crimson against the gray light of the cottage, Agnes sent Will to fetch Mother Elspeth. While she was the village brewester, Elspeth also served as the cunning woman, the keeper of the simples, the herbs and roots gathered in the summer for just such a crisis. Elspeth arrived, her breath a plume of white, carrying a leather pouch that smelled of damp earth and rot. Her intervention was a mixture of practical care and ritual. The mustard poultice. Elspeth crushed dried mustard seeds and mixed them with warm lard, spreading the pungent paste onto a linen rag. She applied this to Ilara's chest.
The goal was rubefaction, drawing blood to the surface to create heat and melt the cold phlegm. The elderberry syrup. She administered a dark, bitter syrup made from elderberries and honey. While we now know elderberries have antiviral properties, Elspeth believed the darkness of the berry fought the whiteness of the winter fever. Cupping. Using a small heated glass horn, she performed dry cupping on the girl's back, creating a vacuum to pull the corrupt humors away from the lungs. Despite her knowledge, Elspeth's face was a mask of grim realism. The herbs can only do so much, Agnes, when the air itself is poison, she muttered. In a house where the central hearth filled the air with acrid smoke and the floor was damp with melted snow, respiratory health was an impossibility. The healer's tools were often futile against the systemic reality of medieval poverty. The passing bell, the reality of death. The contrast between these efforts and the reality of the village was stark. Through the thick walls of the cottage, the Goodwins heard the most dreaded sound of the winter, the passing bell from the village church. It tolled slowly, once for a man, twice for a woman, 3 times for a child. In the absolute silence of the freeze, the bell was the voice of the great cold claiming its tax. The winter maladies were taking the elderly, whose natural heat had flickered out, and the infants, whose humors were too weak to resist the damp. The village priest, Father John, could do little more than Elspeth. He moved from house to house, performing the last rites with frozen fingers, his holy oil turning to a thick paste in the cold. The dead could not even be buried. The ground was frozen as hard as the barren stone walls. The bodies were placed in the church's lich gate, covered in lime and snow, waiting for the earth to soften. The helplessness of the mind. For Thomas, the hardest part was the psychological helplessness. He could fight a wolf, he could repair a wall, but he could not fight the whispers. He watched Agnes pray until her knuckles were white, and he watched Mother Elspeth mutter her charms, yet the rattle in Alara's chest remained. They lived in a state of holy terror. They believed their survival depended on their moral standing, their adherence to ritual, and the strength of their wards. Every morning that they woke up and felt the warmth of their own breath was seen not as a biological success, but as a miraculous reprieve from the unseen forces of the night. As February bled into March, the Goodwins remained huddled, a family of shadows in a house of smoke, caught between the priest's cross and the healer's herbs. They were waiting for a sign, not from the heavens, but from the frozen mud outside. They were waiting for the earth to remember how to be warm.
The Baron's burden. The cold reaches the manor. As the calendar turned toward the grueling final weeks of winter, the focus of Oakhaven shifted. For months, the peasants had looked toward the stone walls of Baron Edmund's manor with a mixture of envy and resentment, imagining a world of roaring fires and limitless feasts. But as the deep freeze entered its 3rd month, a quiet truth began to seep through the village. The cold was a great equalizer. While it did not kill the rich with the same efficiency it did the poor, it dismantled the illusions of aristocratic invulnerability. The manor house, once a symbol of unshakable power, had become a stone prison. The architecture of the elite, the cold sink. In many ways, the Baron's stone manor was harder to heat than Thomas Goodwin's mud-walled cottage. Stone is a high-mass material with high thermal conductivity compared to the air-trapping thatch and straw of a peasant hut. Throughout the winter, the massive granite blocks of the manor acted as a cold sink, absorbing the freezing temperatures and radiating them inward long after the sun had set. While Thomas's home was smoky and cramped, it was small enough for a central hearth to maintain a survivable bubble of warmth. The Baron's great hall, with its soaring timbered ceilings and vast floor space, was a cavern of drafts. Even with two massive fireplaces burning seasoned oak logs day and night, the heat was lost to the rafters almost instantly. The Baron and his family lived in a world of microclimates. They survived by never leaving the immediate radius of the hearth, wrapped in furs that cost more than the entire village of Oakhaven. The failure of luxury, frozen conduits, and rotting silk. The burden of the manor was not hunger, but the collapse of infrastructure. Baron Edmund's manor boasted early forms of luxury that became liabilities in the freeze. The frozen conduits. The manor utilized lead pipes or wooden troughs to bring water from a spring directly into the kitchens and the Baron's private wash basin. By mid-February, these pipes had frozen and burst. The modern convenience had failed, forcing the Baron's servants to haul buckets of ice from the same frozen stream as the peasants. The damp of the stone. Condensation formed on the interior stone walls, running down in frozen rivulets. The magnificent tapestries, designed to tell stories of the Baron's lineage, were heavy with black mold. The silk hangings were rotting in the damp, a silent testament to the fact that even gold cannot stop the decay brought by persistent moisture. Supply chain disruption. The Baron's diet, usually supplemented by imported wines from Aquitaine and spices from the east, was cut off. The roads were impassable. Baron Edmund was reduced to eating the same salted pork and dried peas as his serfs, though perhaps served on silver plate. The stewardship of greed, a cold calculation. The turning point for the Baron came during a meeting with his steward, Master Fitzwilliam. They sat in a small solar, the only room kept truly warm, surrounded by ledgers and tally sticks. "The death toll in the village is rising, my lord," Fitzwilliam reported. "The elders are gone in 6 houses. 2 families have lost their youngest. But more importantly, the livestock is failing." The Baron looked at his ledger. To the aristocratic mind, a dead peasant was a lost revenue stream. If a family perished, their land remained fallow in the spring. If their ox died, the plowing would not happen. "If they starve now, Fitzwilliam," the Baron muttered, "I will have no one to sow the barley in April. And if they have no barley, I have no tax. My own stores are low, but I cannot afford a graveyard instead of a village." This was not an act of charity, it was strategic asset management. The gift of survival, loans, and firewood. The following morning, a proclamation was sent to the village. The Baron would offer relief to Oakhaven, but on terms that ensured his future dominance. The grain loan. The Baron opened his private granary, the seed corn intended for his own profit. He offered a loan of waste grain, the chaff and the sweepings, to the families of Oakhaven. This was not a gift, it was a debt to be repaid at double the volume during the next harvest. The right to firewood. In a rare move, the Baron suspended the woodgeld tax. He allowed the peasants to enter the deeper woods to take standing deadwood, timber that was usually reserved for the manor's secondary buildings. The communal soup. He ordered his kitchens to produce a massive vat of great soup, mostly water, bones, and the outer leaves of the manor's cabbages, to be distributed at the manor gates once a week. Thomas's choice, the price of the Baron's mercy. Thomas Goodwin stood at the manor gates, his hands shoved deep into his woolen sleeves, waiting for his family's portion of the Baron's mercy. He saw the Baron looking down from a high window, a figure of fur and gold, yet one whose face looked just as tired and pale as any man in the village. "He gives us back our own grain, father," Will whispered, shivering, "and he calls it a blessing." "He gives us the chance to see the spring, Will,"
Thomas replied quietly. "In this world, we take the devil's bread if the alternative is a shroud of snow. We will owe him twice over in August, but in August the sun will be warm and we will have the strength to pay." The Baron's burden revealed the fragile symbiosis of the feudal world. The aristocratic life was a gilded cage, dependent entirely on the backs of the shivering men outside the gates. By offering this strategic aid, Baron Edmund wasn't just saving the peasants, he was saving his own future. The turning point had been reached. The cold had pushed both the high and the low to the edge of their endurance. Now, with the Baron's gift in their bellies and the smell of fresh-cut wood in the air, the people of Oakhaven turned their eyes toward the southern horizon, watching for the first softening of the light.
The first thaw, the emotional weight of endurance. If the middle of winter was a war of walls and wood, the transition to spring was a war of the spirit. By the second week of March, the residents of Oakhaven were no longer the people they had been in October. They were hollowed-out versions of themselves, their skin sallow from the lack of sunlight, their bones prominent, and their movements slowed by a profound, systemic lethargy. The first thaw did not arrive as a sudden, sunny day. It began as a shift in the air, a softening of the wind that carried the scent of wet stone and distant, rotting vegetation. For Thomas and Agnes Goodwin, this was the emotional climax of their struggle, the moment where the adrenaline of the crisis faded, leaving only the crushing weight of what they had endured. The hollow days, the psychological toll. The final weeks before the thaw were the hardest. The Baron's mercy had provided just enough calories to keep their hearts beating, but it could not cure the winter exhaustion. This was a psychological state where the mind, tired of constant shivering and darkness, began to retreat. Thomas found himself sitting for hours by the banked fire, staring at nothing. Agnes's hands, once so nimble with the spindle, often sat idle in her lap. They were suffering from a medieval form of cabin fever, combined with the physiological effects of a 1,200-calorie-a-day diet in a 0°C environment. "The light is longer, Thomas," said Agnes one morning, her voice thin, "but the day feels heavier." The endurance required to survive the deep freeze had used up their emotional reserves. They were surviving on habit and the primitive instinct to protect their children, but the joy of living had been temporarily extinguished by the sheer effort of staying alive. The sound of the world waking, the great drip. Then, one night, the silence of the freeze was broken. It wasn't the howl of the wind or the crackle of the hearth. It was a rhythmic, persistent tapping. Drip, drip, drip. Thomas sat up in the communal bed. The sound was coming from the eaves. The heavy, insulating pack of snow on the thatched roof was beginning to melt. By morning, the sound was a chorus. The great drip was the first sensory confirmation that the cycle had turned. The ice that had sealed the window shutters began to weep. The frozen mud of the floor turned into a treacherous, damp slurry. This was the first thaw, and its arrival was palpable relief mixed with a new kind of hardship, the return of the great damp. "Listen, Will," Thomas whispered, holding his son's shoulder as they stood by the door. "That is the sound of the earth breathing again. Quiet grief, the tax of the cold." The thaw, however, brought a grim revelation. As the snow receded, the village was forced to face its losses. The quiet grief settled over Oakhaven as the paths to neighbors' houses became passable again. They learned of the empty chairs at other hearths. Old Mother Elspeth had survived the fever, but succumbed to the slow heart just days before the melt. The miller's youngest child had passed in the night, the winter malady finally claiming its prize. A neighbor, Peter the Fletcher, was found in his bed,
having given his last rations to his children weeks prior. There were no grand funerals. There was only a somber collective recognition of the price they had paid. The village church's lich gate, where the bodies had been stored in the ice, became a site of quiet pilgrimage. The endurance of the survivors was tempered by the knowledge that their victory was incomplete. The promise of the green, the first shoot. The emotional weight of their grief was finally lifted by a small biological miracle. 3 days into the thaw, Thomas and Will ventured to the south-facing edge of the Barrens woods to check on the deadwood. There, in a patch of black mud where the snow had first vanished, Thomas saw it, a snowdrop, a Galanthus nivalis. Its white, drooping bell was small and fragile, yet it had pierced through the frozen crust of the earth with a strength that defied the imagination. Further down, near the stream, the first shoots of wild garlic were pushing upward, a vibrant, defiant green against the gray-brown world. "Look there, Will," Thomas said, kneeling in the mud. He touched the green shoot with a finger that was still cracked from the frost. The earth didn't forget. The promise is kept. The sight of the first green shoots was the psychological turning point. It signaled the end of the scarcity principle. It meant that soon there would be nettles for soup, dandelions for vitamins, and eventually the barley for the bread. It was the physical manifestation of hope, the recovery of the spirit. As the ice continued to recede, the Goodwin family began the slow process of drying out. They opened the shutters wide, letting the pale, weak March sun hit the interior of the cottage for the first time in months. They hauled the damp straw bedding out to be aired. The lethargy began to lift. The smell of the earth, raw, muddy, and fertile, replaced the suffocating scent of peat smoke. "We are still here, Agnes," Thomas said that evening, as they shared a pottage that felt for the first time like it was fueling a future rather than just delaying an end. The emotional weight of endurance had been a heavy burden, but the thaw had begun to wash it away. They had survived the coldest nights not through luck, but through a meticulous, communal, and deeply human refusal to go cold. The cycle was renewed, and though they were weary and scarred, the people of Oakhaven were ready to turn their faces to the sun. The planting ritual, survival confirmed, and the cycle renewed. The year was now 1346. By the first week of April, the deep winter had retreated into the shaded hollows and the memories of the survivors. The landscape of Oakhaven had undergone a violent transformation. The white shroud of the freeze was replaced by a chaotic, muddy landscape of raw browns and vibrant neon greens. The air no longer tasted of metal and smoke. It tasted of damp earth and the sweet rising sap of the willows. For the Goodwin family, the arrival of the sowing season was more than an agricultural deadline. It was the planting ritual, the official confirmation that they had survived the approaching shadow. The inventory of endurance, taking stock. Before the first seed could be cast, Thomas and Agnes stood outside their cottage, performing a silent inventory of their lives. They were thinner, their clothes hung loose on their frames, and Thomas's hands were permanently mapped with the scars of frost-cracked skin. But as the sun hit their faces with a genuine, radiating warmth, the tally was clear. The family, all 5 were present. Ilara, who had rattled with the winter malady in February, was now pale but standing, her eyes bright as she watched a robin pull a worm from the softening mud. The stores, the hidden pit beneath the floor, was empty. The smokehouse was bare. They had survived on the very edge of the scarcity principle, finishing their last handful of grain the morning the first nettles were high enough to harvest. The livestock, the piglet they had brought inside, was now a sturdy juvenile, and the donkey, though its ribs were visible, was braying at the morning light. "We paid the price, Agnes," Thomas said, looking toward the village church where the bell no longer tolled for the dead. "But the lineage is unbroken." The ritual of the seed, opening the hidden store. The most sacred moment of the spring was the opening of the seed grain. In the medieval world, seed was not just food, it was a promise of future time. Thomas had guarded a final bag of barley and rye with a ferocity that bordered on the religious, refusing to touch it even when their bellies were hollowed by hunger. To plant this grain was to perform an act of supreme faith. They were committing their last resource to the earth, trusting that the cycle of rain and sun would return it 100-fold. Thomas carried the sack into the common fields. The soil was sweet, moist enough to crumble, but dry enough not to stick to the plow. This was the window of opportunity they had spent 4 months waiting for. The heavy work, the mold board and the ox. The planting was a communal effort, a return to the neighbor aid that had nearly dissolved during the midwinter crisis. The villagers who remained, gaunt but determined, brought their oxen together to form a plow team. Thomas guided the heavy mold-board plow, a massive timber and iron instrument that did more than scratch the surface. It turned the earth over, burying the weeds and bringing the nutrient-rich subsoil to the top. Behind him, Will walked with a rhythmic stride, broadcasting the seed from a wicker basket slung over his shoulder. There was a profound, wordless poetry in the movement. The sway of the hips, the flick of the wrist, the golden arc of the grain hitting the dark, damp furrows. It was the antithesis of the winter stillness. Adaptation, not conquest, the peasant philosophy. As the day waned and the long, straight lines of the new crop were etched into the valley, Thomas sat on the headland, watching the village of Oakhaven. He realized that their survival wasn't a victory over nature. They hadn't conquered the winter. They had successfully adapted to it. Their survival was the result of 1,000 small, meticulous choices. The thickness of the wattle and daub walls, the smoky, preservative air of the rafters, the shared warmth of the communal bed, the strategic secrecy of the hidden grain. They lived not by dominating the elements, but by moving in rhythm with them. They were part of the ecology of the hills as much as the oaks or the wolves. The winter had thinned the herd. They felt the absence of Mother Elspeth and the others like a physical ache, but the village as an organism had endured. Conclusion: the cycle renewed. The final scene of the saga saw the Goodwin family returning to their cottage as the evening mist began to rise. The hearth was still lit, but the door was left open. The donkey grazed on the new grass, and the chickens scratched in the yard. Agnes stood by the door with her hand on the frame she had patched with mud during the great freeze. "It will happen again, Thomas," she said softly. "The shadows will grow long again in October." "I know," Thomas replied, looking at his son Will, who was already showing the broad shoulders of a plowman. "But we have the wood, we have the knowledge, and we have the earth. We will be ready for the next shadow." The saga of hearth and hardship concluded not with a grand ending, but with a beginning. The cycle of life in Oakhaven continued, a testament to the quiet, unyielding endurance of the medieval peasant, a life of dirt, smoke, and hope, standing defiantly against the coldest nights.
That is where the true spirit of hearth and hardship, how medieval peasants survived the coldest nights, a historical saga, rests. Not in grand feasts or legends, but in the quiet grace of gratitude itself. And as we close tonight's story, I want to thank you for being here, for listening, and for keeping these histories alive. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, consider subscribe, like, comment, and share. where we continue to explore the stories, traditions, and mysteries behind the celebrations that shape our world. Your support helps keep the lantern burning, illuminating the past so that its warmth can reach the present. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, your hearths bright, and your heart filled with gratitude. And I pray for your success and abundance. Good night, and happy holidays.